Hello, I'm Zeinab Badawi and welcome to the Hellenic Cosmos Cultural Centre here in Athens, a city that has been rocked by angry protests against tough austerity measures. The government here says Greece had no choice but to accept the latest bailout deal finally agreed this week. Otherwise, the country would have gone bankrupt and descended into economic chaos. But has Greece merely prolonged the people's suffering and put off the inevitable? Well, that's the subject of our Intelligence Squared Greece debate. Should Greece default on its debts and leave the euro? And we have a great panel lined up arguing for and against the motion. Arguing for the motion, the American economist Nouriel Roubini and the distinguished professor of economics Costas Lapavitsas. Arguing against the motion, the former Europe Minister for the United Kingdom, Denis MacShane, and economist who began her career at the IMF, Miranda Xafa. That's our panel. Welcome to you all. Without much further ado, let's have our first speaker arguing for the motion, Nouriel Roubini, the American economist, sometimes known as Dr. Doom because he predicted the global economic crisis in 2008. He has also advised the US Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, and he is now chairman of Roubini Global Economics. So Nouriel Roubini, your time starts now.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a great pleasure and honor being back here in Athens. So whatever I'm going to say tonight is a friend, somebody who realizes that there are extreme economic difficulties, 20% unemployment, 50% among young people, a recession is becoming a depression, and therefore the question is what to do to get out of it, because this is not a sustainable situation. So I'll make a few points. The first point is that after even the recent debt restructuring agreement and the new agreement for a bailout package with the Troika, and it's not a bailout because it's another 130 billion euros of debt that's going to be borrowed by the Greece and had to be paid back, the official estimate suggests that the public debt of Greece is going to be in 2020, in the best scenario, 120% of GDP. And if the scenario is going to be negative, could be 160% of GDP. So even after that restructuring, even after this program, the debt is still at a level that is not sustainable. Second point about this debt restructuring, a 50% reduction of the debt held by the private sector. People say this is voluntary, this is not a default. We're discussing whether Greece should default, but it is a default because one, it is coercive. It's like somebody coming with a gun to your head and saying, give me 50% of your wealth or reduce my debt by 50%, otherwise I'll shoot you. There's nothing voluntary about it. It's done under coercion. Secondly, rating agencies are going to consider it as a default. They're going to rate the country in selective default. So if it walks and quacks like a default duck, it's a default. So we're not discussing whether it's going to be default or not. This is a default. The question is, can we restore sustainability of the debt of the country? So it's a vicious circle. There was a recession, the deficit becomes larger, you raise taxes, you cut spending, the deficit becomes bigger because there is more recession, and now you are in this vicious circle, it's becoming worse. The question is how you restore growth and competitiveness and external balance. Everybody agrees that you need to have a real depreciation. That means your exports become cheaper, your imports become more expensive, so that your trade balance improves. There are only 4 ways in which you can achieve a real depreciation. Either by miracle the euro falls in value relative to the US dollar by another 30%, or you're going to do structural reforms, but even in Germany, those structural reforms increase competitiveness over 10 years. If you start today, you're not going to see benefits for 5 years. The third option is deflation, reduce prices and wages over the next few years by 30%. But that deflation is also associated with a recession, becomes a depression, like in Argentina. So that doesn't work. So if the euro is not going to be devalued to parity, if competitiveness and structural reform take too long, if deflation is destructive of economic activity, there is only one other option that is painful but the necessary one: devaluation. Going back to the drachma, exiting the eurozone, having a significant depreciation is going to lead to more exports of tourism, of other goods, and reduction of the imports. And therefore, while domestic demand is going to be weak, consumption is falling in the private and public sector, the way you restore growth is by improving your net exports, your trade balance. And for that one, you need a depreciation. And the only only way to achieve this depreciation is going to be to exit the Eurozone and going back to the drachma. Otherwise, you're not going to have economic growth. Otherwise, you're going to have a depression for the next few years. So that leads me to the other point. Of course, there's going to be collateral damage if you're going to exit the Eurozone. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but it can be managed. You can have an agreement with the Troika on the exit, an agreement on how much the currency should depreciate so there is not an overshooting, an agreement to try to have official financing so that you don't end up in high inflation, an agreement to recapitalize your banks so there is not a run on your banks, an agreement on how much and how to convert your assets and your liabilities that are in euro into new drachma. All these things can be negotiated, and official money can be used not to avoid the unavoidable, but to help and make sure that the exit is going to be orderly rather than disorderly. And some people say that if you exit the Eurozone, the drive for reform, structural and otherwise, is not going to be there. That's not true. To do reform, you need economic growth. If there's going to be a recession that becomes a depression, then the backlash against that austerity and those reforms is going to be more significant. If you have economic growth, it's easier to do structural reform with economic growth. You cannot do structural reforms when you have 20% unemployment, 50% among the young, and the situation socially and politically is becoming more and more unstable. So unfortunately, the restructuring is already coercive, is effectively default. More of it will have to occur, and eventually the country will have to decide to exit to restore growth and competitiveness. That's the way to go ahead.
Nouriel Roubini, thank you very much indeed. Well, arguing against the motion is the British Labour MP, Denis MacShane, who served as Europe Minister under Tony Blair. He's been a long-time champion of the euro. He's sometimes been called the big cheese Englishman because he says that his opponent's arguments are full of holes. Denis MacShane, your time starts now.
I can't argue with any of the distinguished economists on this panel. I'm not an economist. I didn't do PPE at Oxford. I remember why, because we were always taught that an economist is someone who knows 365 ways of making love, but has never met a woman. And I want to set this question of Greece in a wider context. The arguments you will hear on the narrow issue of the re-drachmatization and default have been made. But where we're sitting, where we're standing and speaking, this is about geography, about history, about what Europe means. And I say to all of us tonight that the idea of the European Union de facto expelling Greece from its chosen path of the Eurozone would be a huge historic error and a crime against the history of which this nation should be rightly proud. It is not up for us, the crude, cold barbarians of Northern Europe, to deny Greece its choice of what its European destiny might be. By all means, if people want to return to the drachma, let that be. But it should be the free choice of a free people, not something imposed on them by the orthodox economic thinking from outside of Greece. And I speak now not as a European, but as a humble citizen, subject of Her Majesty, because you may have noticed that the English pound has been devalued by about 25% in the last 3 years. Where is this happy nirvana of exports? Where is this massive increase of English tourism? We now have £1 trillion in debt. I don't know how many zeros there are in a trillion. We now have a vision of Europe which would have made Herbert Hoover really proud. Public sector cuts, deflation, take it out of the poor, cut the minimum wage, remove benefits, fire public sector employees. Yes, debt reduction deficits have to be dealt with, but this return to the 1930s is not the right way forward. I love Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. It was said of Ginger Rogers that she did every dance step that Fred Astaire could do, but backwards and in high heels. And when I see Nicolas Sarkozy in his high heels and Angela Merkel trying to dance a tango of deflation, I just say learn from Europe's history. Because this is also, though, not the solution of technocrats. Mr. Barroso, Mr. Van Rompuy, the European Commission are dead. This is about raw politics, bad politics, Hellenophobic politics in too many capital cities. Because giving the drachma back to Greece will make no difference. What Greece needs, what Britain needs, what Germany needs, what France needs is a change of monetary and economic policy, not a change of currency. And to return to a Europe of every currency fighting with every currency, because it won't stop with Greece. It'll be Portugal next, then Spain, then France, and of course the speculators will be clearing up. The ratings agencies will be clearing up. And when are we going to have a ratings agency for the ratings agencies? And so we now need, yes, hard and difficult decisions by the Greek people, by their businessmen. It would be very nice if occasionally a Greek shipper turned up and paid some tax. It would be very nice if occasionally the Greek church paid some tax. But I don't want to make any offensive or derogatory remarks. But returning to the drachma will not make this happen. European solidarity is not about leaving Greece to die, but finding ways of helping Greece, I hope with a change of policy, a change of thinking. We mustn't let that happen to Greece again. So, ochi to the drachma, nay to the euro. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Denis MacShane, thank you very much. Well, you seem to get quite a bit of applause there, didn't you, Denis? And arguing for the motion that Greece should default on its debts and leave the euro is Costas Lapavitsas. He is Greek-born, but now is now a distinguished professor of economics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Costas, you're already there, springing to action, so please start.
I will speak as a political economist, but I will also speak as a Greek. Where does the Greek problem come from? The Greek problem is similar to that of the rest of the peripheral countries. It's not specific to Greece. It's the same as other countries, and it has to do with being trapped in the Eurozone, a system whereby frozen German wages basically mean that other countries steadily lose competitiveness. Loss of competitiveness across all these other countries has meant that they've accumulated huge deficits, external deficits, and therefore debt. Debt is a product of huge external deficits by and large. The problem was masked by cheap credit for a long time until the crisis hit. Public debt problem is an outcome, it's not the cause of the crisis. Now, the assessment of the EU, however, was quite different. The problem presumably came from the state. This is what the EU decided. It came from profligacy, and therefore austerity was necessary, and it came from too much state weakening the competitive drive of these various economies, hence liberalize, privatize, and reduce wages. The standard cure was applied, the holy trinity, austerity, liberalization, privatization. Well, there was one difference, no devaluation. Usually the IMF would have applied this thing with devaluation. Here it couldn't do it, and hence the program failed, and it failed abysmally. We're in a depression, we've got enormous unemployment, we've got debt to GDP ratio getting out of kilter, and the country is in deep trouble. The current deal is more of the same. The current deal doesn't solve the problem, it's exactly the same logic. Take the state out of the economy, impose austerity on top of austerity, liberalization, privatization, crush wages. The difference is debt reduction. Presumably voluntary, but of course it's not voluntary, it's actually a default, but it's not a default that is going far enough. It will fail. What must Greece do? It must break free. It must break free from this, it must default and exit, but that's not enough. It needs a cessation of payments. it needs a cessation of payments, and then it needs democracy and accountability. It's unbelievable that the debt has been handled in the way it's been handled so far, in secrecy, by a government that is largely led by an unelected person, by a team that we don't know. So we need transparency, we need an audit commission on the debt, and we need to coerce the lenders. For this, you need democratic intervention. But we also need exit. Now, it will be a short-term shock, no question at all about it. It will be a short-term shock, because what the country is doing at the moment is slow death. Never a short-term shock would justify long-term decline and death. There will be three areas of crisis. The monetary aspect of the crisis isn't very severe, let me tell you. It's not that difficult to do. The currency can be changed. There will be parallel circulation, there will be disruption, but that's not really the major problem of getting out of the euro. The major problem is the banks. The banks will come under a lot of pressure, and dealing with the banks will require sustained intervention. What would it require? I'll tell you what it would require. It would require public ownership and public control. Now, you might think I'm being extreme, but that's exactly what's happening at the moment. The third thing that we'll need to do, that will be a source of crisis, will be, of course, trade. Now, medium to long term, trade will be favored by exit from the euro, of course, because there will be a recapturing of the domestic market by the productive forces of the country, and there will be a growth of exports. Now, default and exit are not an easy option. I never suggested that for a minute. And not enough by themselves to change the situation. They should act as a catalyst for a broad program of change, which is what this country needs. It needs change from top to bottom, and this broad program of change could also act as a catalyst for broader change in Europe. This is what Greece has got in front of it. It needs a program of capital controls, a program of redistribution of income and wealth, a program of industrial policy, and a program of restructuring the state. This is a total crisis for Greece. This isn't just an economic crisis. We better be aware of it and face up to the tasks that were brought in front of us. I believe that the Greek people are capable of doing it. They've shown enough mettle. I trust in their ability to face up to their problems. And I put it to you that this is the way the reality will take us. Thank you.
Costas Lapavitsas, thank you. Now, our final speaker to put her arguments is Miranda Xafa, an economist. She now heads her own consultancy here in Athens, but she began her career as an economist at the International Monetary Fund and has also previously advised a Greek conservative government. So, arguing against the motion, please, your time starts now, Miranda.
Greece has just concluded an agreement in principle with her creditors on a second rescue package and a write-down of the debt due to private bondholders. The economy has just entered its 5th year of recession, and this new program will bring more austerity. Faced with these gloomy prospects, some observers have called for Greece to drop out of the euro area. But a return to the drachma would only bring pain and no gain. Greece is facing two big problems. The first problem is an unsustainable debt burden, and the second is an uncompetitive economy. Returning to the drachma would not resolve either problem. It would mean instant default, because Greece's debt is denominated in euros, not in drachmas. And in terms of competitiveness, it would not resolve the problem, because Greece's competitiveness problem does not reflect so much high wages in the private sector. So the question is whether a post-Soviet economy like the Greek economy can deflate itself back to competitiveness. And the answer is no, because there are so many real rigidities that prevent markets from working. This is why the new program includes broad-based structural reforms intended to introduce flexibility in labor markets and intensify competition in goods and services markets. It includes labor market reform, product market reform, administrative reform, and bank restructuring. It took a long time for Greece to get into this mess, and it will take a long time for Greece to get out. Last year, Greece's current account deficit still amounted to 10% of GDP, which means that consumption is up here and production is down there. And what this new program permits Greece to do is to have a soft landing where the gap closes gradually through a combination of adjustment and financing. Without this new program, this gap will close like this, meaning that tomorrow morning there will be no financing, and Mr. Lapavitsas' solution that we should default on our debt and everything will be fine just does not fly. For the simple reason that no country has ever devalued its way to prosperity. And this can only be addressed through structural reform, not through monetary reform. Greece's railway company has more employees than it has passengers. And this prompted former finance minister Stefanos Manos to say it would be cheaper to send people by taxi. What the railroad company needs is restructuring and privatization, not devaluation. No Greek hotel, restaurant, or taxi driver will change euro income into Greek drachmas, knowing that the Greek drachma tomorrow will be worth less than today. The Greek drachma would be the main currency for government employees and pensioners. Final point is that if Greece drops out of the Eurozone, the inevitable adjustment to a lower standard of living will happen through inflation, and it will be unfairly distributed. It is the poor people who are most exposed to inflation because they do not own inflation-protected assets. They don't have foreign bank accounts. So a disorderly bankruptcy and return to the Greek drachma would create the conditions of economic chaos and uncontrollable social explosion. The redenomination of all contracts from euros to drachmas is tantamount to an expropriation of savings. Debtors will benefit, including some media owners who are heavily indebted and have been very much against this second program. And depositors will lose. And finally, looking back to the drachma period, there was a recurrence of currency crises that were resolved through devaluation. But this never improved competitiveness on a lasting basis, and it never will. Thank you.
Miranda Xafa, thank you very much. So, audience, you've heard the views and the opening arguments of our panel. It's your turn to put your comments and your questions to us. But before we do that, I want to give you the results of the pre-debate vote. And